An insurrection in the United States, an attack on democracy, and today we share a Caribbean perspective. That's up next on Carib Nation. The date, Wednesday, January 6, 2021, will forever remain in the American history as the day of the 2021 insurrection. A riotous mob of people stormed the United States Capitol, intent on halting the official count of the electoral vote that would confirm Joe Biden as the winner of the November 2020 election. So how is this viewed by Caribbean nationals, both inside and outside the United States? Joining me to share some thoughts about this are Eugenia Charles, host of the Washington-based Creole and English bilingual radio program, KOMBIT LAKAI, which keeps listeners informed about what's happening in Haiti. We're also joined by Patrick COZIER, retired Secretary General of the Caribbean Broadcasting Union based in Barbados. Thank you so much for joining me, both of you, and welcome to Carib Nation.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to get some reflection on what your first reactions were when you heard about the insurrection in the United States. And let me start with you, Eugenia, because I know that Haiti has a situation very similar right now.
I think January 6th event here in the United States, it was like a wow. Is this happening here? No, I can't believe it. For us, for me personally, as a person who's been living here in Washington, D.C. for quite some time, and I remember before even 9/11, the way we were able to just, move about on the Capitol grounds and walk in and just visit. And then watching this thing happen, the first thing that went to my mind is, oh my God, things will never be the same again. We will not be able to visit the Capitol the way we used to with all the level of security that will happen. But I was also looking at the behaviors and the manners in which the officers were handling the people who were entering the Capitol to come and disturb that process that is so sacred and important to the democratic process here in the United States. I expected a little bit of force from the officers to prevent the people from entering. But as you can see, I was watching the TV, you can see, there was one individual who just went through, opened the door, left it open, people walked in, and some of the officers, they were having conversation and posing. For me, that was very shocking, in a sense that I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a sacred process. This is supposed to be democracy. Those kind of things are not supposed to happen here in America. But then I thought, you know what? Back home, we've had experienced this type of process, interruption in so many different levels. And in a large part, it is due to the interference of the international community, particularly the involvement of the United States. And you spoke about Jean-Bertrand Aristide. We had two coups d'etats in Haiti. They were both supported by the U.S. forces here in the United States. And not only that, beyond Aristide, we had the election with the former president KREYOL, who's passed now. There were issues with his second elections, and the people had to go into the Montana hotels and beg and take out on the streets for him to get recognized as president. We had issues with the elections dealing with former President Joseph Michel Martelly. He was number 5 in the electoral process, but then former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton pushed for him to go to the second round and impose him on the Haitian people. That was also the involvement of the U.S. And again, with the current president that we have, Jovenel Moïse. But my, that was quite an experience.
Patrick, what is your take on how the rest of the Caribbean sees it? And of course, Barbados, but generally across the Caribbean, what do you think people take from this?
Well, first of all, it was a great shock and very disturbing when you consider the implications of it. You know, seeing a crowd outside demonstrating is one thing. Seeing them burst into the Capitol to interrupt one of the most important decisions within the democracy, which is the confirmation of a president. This was an insurrectionist group intent on creating mayhem, intent on disturbing the democratic process. And unfortunately, and what I find most disturbing of all, is the fact that it appears as though they have been assisted from the inside, which means that the rot is not on the outside that you can shave it off. It's now within. And that is very disturbing to the process. When one considers that America professes to be a global leader in the advancement and the promotion of democracy, to see their democracy fall into such disarray is in fact disturbing, because one wonders what kind of moral influence they will now be able to exert on other countries in pursuance of you know, proper democratic ideals. So the whole thing is disturbing from that standpoint. It was almost surreal watching the events unfold, I guess because nobody quite expected it here. But I think that there are a myriad of questions that need to be asked. I know the FBI is doing their own investigation, but I think there may need to be a presidential commission set up to understand why the Capitol was undersecured, especially given the warnings that the FBI gave about the potential disturbances on that day. Was there inside collaboration, and if so, who and how? Who funded these activities?
Right.
You know, a whole slew of questions, including the involvement of possible Congress people.
Yeah, there are lots of questions, especially when you see the number of Congress people whose lives are in danger, but yet went straight back to the vote and still voted against the recount that morning. It makes you wonder what will shake these people up. If that didn't shake them up into reality, then what will?
The reality, there's a reality that I think we're going to have to face and accept. And that reality is that the Republican Party is scared stiff of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
They believe that he controls the party. They believe that he controls the votes, and therefore they don't want to cross him in any way, or else they will get primaried. And so really it is about their own political self-preservation, arising out of their continuing fear of President Trump.
There's something we need to look at in this country. From the elections of President Obama, during the 8 years he was in office, there was a lot of challenges. And some of those challenges, of course, came from President Trump as well. And you saw after he took office, he made every effort to distort any type of policy that the Obama administration had put into place. And the fact that we are now having a vice president who is also born of foreign parents, I think that's a big challenge to many in this country. Racism is still very much alive in this country. I think President Trump was able to give a platform to many of the people who kind of share those type of sentiments, and he was able to nourish and nurture them in some ways. So I think as we look at our democratic process here in the United States, we have to begin some kind of healing process to bridge those gaps. You know, we lost a lot of people. We've got the issue of the Black Lives Matters. I know we'll talk about that more. But I think looking at how the people enter the Capitol, and you see some of the police officers who are interacting with those folks who enter the Capitol, it was unbelievable. And you could imagine, had it been Black people who are entering the Capitol, what would have happened?
Well, that was my other point I wanted to raise, because when we look at the Black Lives Matter issue and the protests there, we saw police on horses, we saw National Guardsmen with guns drawn in the nation's capital, clearing a park that is a national park, an open public park, for the president to walk across for a photo op. And the number of lives that were affected even then in that short protest, we haven't even heard the end of that. And I wonder, when you see something like that, do you then fear what is happening with Black people? What will happen with Black people in this country? Does it make you worry about your young Black children growing up in this mentality? Or do you have the hope that this might have turned up some things that will change?
I think as a parent myself, and I have many friends who have children in this country, raising Black children in this country is very challenging, because you have to prepare them to be who they are as individuals, and not only being Americans, being born here, but also, we bring our own culture into it. So when I'm raising my kids, I'm raising them not just to be Americans, but they are Haitian Americans. There are certain things that is expected of them, how they should behave and act and that sort. But at the same time, every time they're stopping outside the door, I have to remember to remind them, remember when you get certain places, be cautious, look around you, look at how people are looking at you. All of that comes into account. And then with police brutalities, as a person, when I drive out on the street, every time I get stopped by a police officers, you're like going out of your seat because you are worried. And it's kind of challenging, and young Black men and men that are living in this country dealing with that issue on a regular basis, dealing with profilings and watching the protests with the passing of Mr. Floyd. And you see all the way the police handled the protesters and the level of security that was deployed to prevent people from going out to demonstrate, and the level of people that were arrested as well during the protest. It was unbelievable. And then watching that contrast with what happened on the Capitol, I remember one lady who got tear gas or got hurt in some level. She was like, "Oh my God, I got tear gas." And I'm thinking, do you know what Black people go through when they go out to protest? For me, I was like, what? You entered the Capitol, you violated a sacred place, and like you got tear gas, and you think, okay, that's like was not supposed to happen. What are you thinking? But you see that I think we have a lot of work to do to bring that democratic process together, that social justice together.
We also have to remember that for the people looking on, we have, as Patrick said earlier, America has penalized countries and people for what they claim to be non-democratic practices. And when you see the democratic process under attack like this from what we now know is internal terrorism, when we have policies that are blocking people from coming into the country, or that are watchful about people coming into the country, how do we think about legislation? Because I'm not sure that legislation alone will make the difference. We have to do a lot more engaging at the people-to-people level. And I wonder, what is your take on how, as individuals, that is going to happen? Patrick?
Well, first of all, there are certain things we have to connect with and understand is a starting point. Race is America's enduring pandemic. It has always been and always will be, until you can find a sufficient demographic and ethnographic change in the United States of America that will alter that. Second thing, Donald Trump was not the problem. He was a symptom of the problem. The problem resides among the 74 million people who voted to get him re-elected, among whom are these insurrectionists and white supremacist groups and Proud Boys and Boogaloos and all of those people. So the question is, how do you address it if it is so endemic within the society? In 1984, conservative politician Pat Buchanan wrote a book called The Brown Men of America. And I think that that is what set off the beginning of a new resurgence of white supremacy. It had to stay underground because it was not politically correct. Barack Obama was a lightning bolt for it because some people could not bear the thought of a black man in the White House. And Donald Trump provided a megaphone and made it legit for them to come out and come out even in such a visceral way. So that is a context within which you have to start reimagining how you're going to confront this problem. It's deep, it's long, and there's certain elements of reality that a number of Americans don't want to accept. For instance, America is a country of immigrants, but today the hostility towards immigrants is at its highest. I mean, that's a dichotomy. So that how do you get people connected to one, reality, and two, to trying to purge themselves of things that have been institutionalized into their system over generations. That is the challenge.
Well, how can we then break this down in terms of how the Black Lives Matter movement can help? How do you see the Black Lives Matter dovetailing with making this change that we need to turn things around? Eugenia, any thoughts on that?
I mean, Black Lives Matter movement is very important, but I think it's also for us, the Black community in this country, to take the step necessary to build their own economics in this country as well. As you know, when you look at even now we're going through the pandemic, the levels of Black people that are dying from COVID-19 and the economic discrepancies among Blacks and whites in this country. So we have a lot of work to do to become a self-sufficient in this nation and to create spaces and forums where our people can continue to prosper. In terms of dealing with the race issue, that has been here for years, hundreds of years since we've been in this country, in existence in this nation. It is not gonna fade away quickly. We have to find ways. I know just passing policies on bills on Congress is not gonna be sufficient. You need the people to stay active, to stay engaged, to stay involved, to deal with it on a regular basis. You have to get all the leaders, whether it's community, churches, pastors, and priests involved in it as well, to keep talking to people and maybe create some kind of dialogue for a healing process to see where we can bridge some of those gaps. But we also have to understand that there are some people who will probably never come to a level where they can agree to see Black and white people mingling together, working together.
Before this program, I was listening to a webinar by the Brookings Institution, and they pointed out that there was someone who was doing a PhD, and she was looking at this whole system of Black and white relationship and Black Lives Matter. And somebody asked her a very pointed question: has anybody stopped to research white supremacy? And it seems that everybody's looking at everything else. and nobody is delving into the history, the origins, the feelings, and everything behind white supremacy. And she changed her entire PhD program to look into white supremacy, because somebody needs to look into that and understand that and help the rest of the world understand what it is that we're dealing with and what it is we're up against. Because we can have Black Lives Matter as much as we want, we can have as much legislation as we want, but even though one of the things that bothers me is that while there is racism around the world, America is the only place in the world where racism has been legislated.
That's true.
There are laws. And that, to me, tells me that we have to do a lot more about looking to the root of this issue and see where we can uproot it.
First of all, you cannot legislate for people's attitudes, okay? So
Right.
you can pass all the legislation you want. If people fundamentally don't want to change their attitude, it is going to make no difference. What you can do is level out from some of the laws that are unjust or imbalanced. One of the things you got to do is to stop allowing the infiltration of police forces by white supremacists. Police reform, the ability now to construct relationships between police and communities where they can work together, where white people don't see the police as protectors and Black people don't see police as oppressors. But everybody sees the police in what they should be doing, which is to protect and serve. Let me also say this. Has anybody been actively working within recent times in the development of a Black economic development agenda, where we look at getting Black people to support Black businesses more, about developing linkages and joining maybe with brown Hispanics? Because as you know, some Hispanics are white-skinned Hispanics and they identify with American whites. Asian Americans coming together as a group and saying, look, we are like a minority coalition. Let us see how we can develop our own franchises, our own development, economic development franchises, how we support and spend our money with each other. Those kinds of things. You need to have an agenda that does that. I also need to have an agenda that goes in, the community can start now almost policing itself in terms of alleviating some of the crime activities that take place in low-income areas and so forth. So there's a myriad of problems. It requires a multifaceted approach, but it has to be based on a positive development agenda and not depending on legislation for that.
In terms of America's role around the world, and especially to their relationship with third world or developing countries as we are coming from the Caribbean, what do you think needs to be the position or the stance of these governments that they will have to work with?
Well, the first thing America has to do is to decide how it wants to reposition itself in the world. As you know, under Trump, they moved away from engagement with a lot of the world and issues with NATO, issues with the Paris Accord, the South Asian treaty that was put in place to give some measure of advantage to American exporters. Trump has basically pulled everything back. and focused inward in America. So America has to determine its own repositioning. Secondly, it has to realize that it's going to be a gradual process to the recovering of their, what should we call it, the democratic credentials overseas. The third thing that has to be recognized is, how do you want to treat with the Caribbean? Traditionally, America has treated with the Caribbean at times when they perceive potential threats in the Caribbean as being threats to the American backyard. They pay attention, but once those things like the Cold War was over, forgot about the Caribbean. The Caribbean does probably more trade in both directions, which is importing stuff and also having tourists from America. So there is a very strong interdependency with, between Caribbean economies and the US. I think that the US should in fact be investing in expanding that relationship instead of waiting for Chinese to come and do it and then crying out, tell you no way to borrow, get any Chinese money. So where's your check? You know? So there has to be a total reassessment and determination as to how America wants to reposition itself overseas and reposition with its allies.
Yeah. Eugenia, I think
Yes,
you have the last word.
Thank you. I think in terms of particularly for Haiti, when we look at what happened here in the capital, that's definitely says something to us. But from the democratic approach perspectives, the way in which the US has implemented democracy in Haiti, for me, I call it a selectocracy. It has not been democratic implementations. So the bilateral relationships between Haiti and the United States needs to be looked at from a different approach. And we Haitians, we need to position ourselves to dictate better the type of policies we want implemented in Haiti. And the forceful selectocratic process that the US have been enforcing on Haiti has been detrimental to the moving forward of our nascent democratic process. So I think given what happened in the capital and what's happening in Haiti now, the US need to select their diplomats more carefully, people with more experience and who understand what democracy is when they are sending diplomats into Haiti. We are not looking to have governors from the United States to be in Haiti, since Haiti is still an independent and sovereign nation. So in both ways, we need to reevaluate those processes, and the money that are being invested through USAID need to be used to support proper development instead of pushing for pluralism through different various political parties that can create chaos in the nations.
Well said. Well, thank you so much to both of you. It's been quite an interesting discussion. We have an idea of what the Caribbean thinks, and we look to see what happens with the Biden administration. We will hopefully address that issue as well in another program coming up sometime. So thank you so much again to both of you for joining me for this discussion.
My pleasure.
And until next time, thank you for watching us on Carib Nation. And remember, our motto is one people, one culture, one Caribbean, one nation. I'm Derek Dean.